The crimson sands of Kepler 442b whipped across the canyon floor, creating a hissing symphony that had become the soundtrack to their failure. Zara Night Whisper pressed her sleek form against the rocky outcrop, her iridescent silver skin catching the pale light of the system's twin suns. Her violet eyes, large and luminous like polished amethysts, tracked the movement of guards on the compound's towers 3 kilometers away. "Another miss," growled Theron Blackclaw, the team's primary marksman, as his shot sparked harmlessly off the fortified walls. His scaled green skin darkened with frustration, and his reptilian features twisted into a snarl. "The atmospheric distortion is too severe. No one can make this shot." Zara's delicate features remained composed, though internally she shared his frustration. 23 hostages, scientists from the Galactic Research Consortium, were trapped inside that compound, and every passing moment brought them closer to execution. The crime syndicate holding them had chosen their location well, a narrow canyon with only one approach, defended by energy barriers that required precise targeting to disable. "Perhaps if we wait for the storm to pass," began Lioness Starweaver, her blue-tinted skin glowing softly with bioluminescent patterns that betrayed her anxiety. "There's no time," Zara interrupted, her voice carrying the musical quality typical of her species. "Intelligence reports suggest the syndicate will begin executing hostages at sunset. We have less than 4 hours." The team had been handpicked from the finest warriors across the galaxy. Theron's people, the Drakmari, were renowned for their marksmanship. Lioness' luminal race possessed enhanced visual acuity that made them excellent spotters. Zara's own people, the Ethereal, were known for their tactical brilliance and grace in combat. Together, they should have been unstoppable. Yet here they were, stymied by a shot that seemed to mock the laws of physics itself. "Maybe we should consider the human suggestion," Lioness said quietly, her glow dimming to barely visible levels. Zara's jaw tightened. The human. Marcus Vale sat apart from their group, his weathered face calm despite the urgency of their situation. He'd been assigned to their team by the Mercenary Guild, a last-minute addition that none of them had requested. Humans were relatively new to the galactic community, and their reputation was mixed. Some saw them as resourceful and adaptable. Others viewed them as reckless and primitive. His suggestion was suicide, Theron spat. A direct assault on the main gate? Their defensive grid would cut us down before we took 10 steps. Not the main gate, came a gravelly voice from behind them. Marcus Vale approached with that peculiar human gait, less graceful than other species, but somehow purposeful. His dark hair was streaked with premature gray, and his brown eyes held a depth that suggested he'd seen things that would break lesser minds. The auxiliary power coupling. Top of the eastern tower. Zara found herself studying the human more closely than she cared to admit. He wore standard mercenary gear, but his rifle was clearly custom-made, its sleek line suggesting modifications that went beyond standard specifications. There was something about the way he moved, economical, precise, that reminded her of apex predators from her homeworld. "That coupling is smaller than a dinner plate," Theron protested. "In this wind, with the atmospheric distortion, it's impossible to hit from this range." Marcus's lips quirked in what might have been a smile. "Impossible's just another word for something nobody's figured out how to do yet." Zara felt an unexpected flutter in her chest at his quiet confidence. Her people prized intellectual sophistication and emotional control, but there was something appealing about the human's unshakable certainty. "Show me your calculations," she said, moving closer to him. This close, she could smell his scent, something earthy and warm that was distinctly human. Marcus looked surprised. "Calculations? Atmospheric density, wind vectors, gravitational differential." Zara's voice trailed off as she realized he was looking at her with genuine confusion. "How do you plan to compensate for the variables?" "I don't." He shrugged, beginning to unpack his rifle with practiced efficiency. "I just shoot." Theron let out a harsh laugh. "Primitive. I told you humans were all instinct and no intelligence." Zara felt a flash of irritation on Marcus's behalf, which surprised her. She barely knew the human, yet something about Theron's dismissive tone rankled. Perhaps we should let him try, she found herself saying. Our methods haven't succeeded. Marcus looked at her with those deep brown eyes, and she felt her breath catch. There was gratitude there, but also something else, a warmth that made her silver skin tingle. Thank you, he said simply. I won't let you down. He moved to the edge of their rocky shelter and began setting up his rifle. His movements were fluid, practiced, and Zara found herself mesmerized by the quiet competence he displayed. This close, she could see the scars on his hands, the lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent in dangerous places. Winds gusting at 43 knots, Lyanna reported, her enhanced vision reading the atmospheric conditions. Atmospheric pressure is. It's fine, Marcus interrupted gently, settling into his shooting position. I've got this. Zara crouched beside him, studying his profile. His face was utterly calm, almost meditative. There was none of the tension she'd seen in other snipers before a difficult shot. Instead, he seemed to be listening to something only he could hear. How do you know? She asked quietly. How can you be certain? He turned his head slightly, and their faces were suddenly very close. Close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, close enough that his breath warmed her cheek. Sometimes you have to trust something deeper than calculations, he said. Sometimes you have to trust what you feel. The word sent an unexpected shiver through her. Her people didn't speak of feelings, they spoke of logic, of proven methodologies, of predictable outcomes. But there was something in Marcus's voice that made her want to understand what he meant. Target acquired, he murmured, his eye finding the scope. Winds shifting, now. The rifle's report was sharp in the desert air. Zara watched through her binoculars as the projectile traced an impossible arc through the swirling atmosphere, bending around air currents that should have sent it spinning off course. The auxiliary power coupling exploded in a shower of sparks. The compound's energy barriers flickered and died. Impossible, Theron breathed, his scaled features slack with shock. No, Zara said softly, her violet eyes fixed on Marcus as he calmly began packing his rifle. Just, human. Marcus looked up and caught her staring. This time, his smile was full and genuine, transforming his weathered features into something almost boyish. Told you I wouldn't let you down, he said. Zara felt her heart racing in a way that had nothing to do with the adrenaline of combat. There was something about this human, his quiet confidence, his unconventional methods, the way he made the impossible seem effortless, that called to something deep inside her. The barriers are down, Lyanna announced, her bioluminescent patterns now pulsing with excitement. We have a clear path to the compound. As the team prepared for the assault, Zara found herself walking beside Marcus. The rescue mission was far from over, but something had shifted between them in that moment when his impossible shot found its mark. Marcus, she said quietly, testing the way his name felt on her tongue. Yes. When this is over, would you teach me? About trusting what you feel? His smile was answer enough. The compound loomed ahead, its defenses breached by a shot that defied every law of physics her species had ever documented. But as they moved forward together, Zara realized that perhaps the most impossible thing of all was the way her heart had suddenly learned to trust in possibilities she'd never considered before. The desert wind carried them forward, and for the first time since the mission began, Zara felt truly confident in their chances of success. After all, she was beginning to understand that with Marcus Vale, impossible was just another word for something that hadn't happened yet. The rescue shuttle Stardancer bucked violently as another plasma bolt seared past its hull, the impact throwing Elena Voss hard against her pilot's seat. Her auburn hair whipped around her face as she pulled the ship into a spiraling dive between two massive asteroids, the proximity alarms screaming warnings that she'd learned to ignore years ago. This is madness, roared Kane Stormheart from the co-pilot's seat, his powerful hands gripping the armrests so tightly that his claws left gouges in the metal. His draconic features, sharp cheekbones, golden eyes with vertical pupils, and scales that shifted from deep crimson to burnished copper depending on his mood, were set in a mask of barely controlled fury. Standard evasion protocols exist for a reason. Elena threw him a wild grin, her green eyes sparkling with the kind of reckless joy that made her either the best pilot in 3 sectors or the craziest, depending on who you asked. Standard protocols are for people who want to die boring deaths, she shot back, yanking the controls hard to starboard as a massive asteroid tumbled past their starboard wing. In the passenger compartment behind them, the rescued scientists clung to their safety harnesses while Marcus tended to the wounded and Zara coordinated their escape route. The mission had been a success, all 23 hostages were safe, but the crime syndicate had called in favors, and now 3 heavily armed pursuit ships were hunting them through the Helios asteroid field. Incoming missiles. Kane announced, his enhanced draconic senses picking up the weapon's heat signatures before the ship's sensors could register them. 8 thermal seekers, bearing. I see them, Elena interrupted, her fingers dancing across the controls with practiced ease. She killed the main engines and activated the maneuvering thrusters, sending the shuttle into a flat spin that carried them behind a cluster of smaller asteroids. The missiles, following their last known trajectory, slammed harmlessly into the rocky debris. Kane's golden eyes widened despite himself. It was an impossible maneuver, the kind of thing that should have torn the ship apart or sent them spinning out of control into the asteroid field. Instead, Elena had made it look effortless. How did you, he began. Feel, Elena said, echoing something she'd heard Marcus say earlier. Sometimes you just have to feel what the ship wants to do. Kane's scales rippled from copper to a darker bronze, a sign of confusion among his people. Ships don't want anything. They're machines. They follow the laws of physics and respond to pilot input according to predetermined parameters. Elena laughed, a sound like silver bells in the shuttle's cramped cockpit. Maybe your ships do. But Stardancer and I, we have an understanding. As if to prove her point, she caressed the throttle controls and the ship responded like a living thing, weaving between asteroids with a grace that defied its bulky design. Kane found himself studying her profile, the determined set of her jaw, the way her fingers moved over the controls like a musician playing a complex piece, the small scar on her left temple that suggested she'd survived crashes that would have killed most pilots. 3 ships closing from Vector 77 Mark IV, he reported, trying to focus on his duties rather than the way her laugh had sent an unexpected warmth through his chest. His people valued discipline, order, the tried and true methods that had served them for millennia. This human woman was chaos incarnate, and yet. Perfect, Elena murmured, her eyes scanning the asteroid field ahead. Kane, I need you to trust me. Trust you to do what? She turned to look at him directly, and the intensity in her green eyes made his breath catch. Something impossible. Before he could object, she killed all the ships running lights and dove into the shadow of the largest asteroid in the field, a massive chunk of iron and nickel that stretched for kilometers in every direction. The pursuit ships followed, their sensors locked onto Stardance's heat signature. Elena, Kane said carefully, his tactical training screaming warnings at him, this asteroid has a decaying orbit. The gravitational stresses are. I know, she said softly, her hands steady on the controls. That's what makes it perfect. She brought them closer to the asteroid's surface, so close that Kane could see the pockmarks left by smaller impacts, the veins of rare metals threading through the rock. The pursuing ship spread out, trying to box them in against the asteroid's mass. Now, Elena whispered. She fired the engines at full power, not away from the asteroid but directly at it, using the massive rock's gravity well to slingshot them around its far side at a velocity that should have liquefied every person on board. Instead, she'd calculated the trajectory perfectly, using the asteroid's own rotation and gravitational field to accelerate them beyond their pursuers' ability to follow. The 3 pursuit ships, trying to match their maneuver, weren't so lucky. The gravitational stresses that Elena had somehow intuited tore one of them apart, while the other 2 collided with each other in a spectacular explosion that lit up the asteroid field. As they cleared the field's edge and jumped to hyperspace, Kane sat in stunned silence. Everything about Elena's flying violated every principle of safe piloting he'd ever learned, yet she'd saved them all with a maneuver that would be studied in flight academies for generations. Impossible, he said finally. Elena powered down the engines and turned to face him fully. This close, he could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly now that the adrenaline was wearing off. She was younger than he'd initially thought, maybe 30 standard years, still practically a child by draconic standards, but there was something ancient in her eyes, a depth that spoke of losses that had aged her beyond her years. "Why do you keep saying that?" she asked. "Marcus made an impossible shot, I flew an impossible escape route. Maybe impossible is just what happens when you stop believing in limitations." Kane's scales shifted again, this time to a warm gold that he hoped she wouldn't notice. Among his people, that particular color shift indicated attraction, and he wasn't ready to acknowledge what he was feeling for this reckless, brilliant human woman. "My people have a saying," he said carefully. "The blade that cuts deepest follows the path that has been traveled before." Elena raised an eyebrow. "Meaning?" "Meaning that wisdom comes from following proven methods. From learning from those who came before us." "Your methods?" He gestured helplessly at the controls. "They're completely unpredictable." "Predictable is boring," Elena said with a grin. "Predictable gets you killed when the other guy knows exactly what you're going to do next." She was right, and that bothered him more than he cared to admit. His people's approach to warfare, and to life, was built on discipline, on following established protocols that had been tested over centuries. But watching Elena work, seeing the way she seemed to merge with her ship and make the impossible look effortless, it was like watching poetry in motion. "Kane," she said, and his name in her voice sounded different somehow, softer, more intimate. "Can I ask you something?" He nodded, not trusting his voice. "Why did you volunteer for this mission? A rescue operation isn't exactly standard procedure for someone with your military background." The question caught him off guard. He'd been wondering the same thing himself ever since they'd launched from the staging area. His service record was exemplary, he was the kind of soldier who followed orders, completed missions, and never questioned the chain of command. Volunteering for a joint species mercenary operation should have been completely out of character. He paused, his golden eyes meeting her green ones. "I wanted to understand." "Understand what?" "How other species think. How they solve problems. My people, we're very set in our ways. Sometimes I wonder if we're missing something important." Elena's expression softened. "And what do you think now?" Kane looked at her, really looked at her, taking in the determined set of her shoulders, the way her hands still rested protectively on the ship's controls, the small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. She was everything his people would disapprove of, impulsive, unconventional, willing to take risks that would give a draconic military planner nightmares. She was also the most extraordinary person he'd ever met. "I think," he said slowly, "that maybe the most important discoveries happen when you stop following the map." Elena's smile widened, and she reached over to cover his hand with hers. Her skin was warm against his scales, and he felt that telltale color shift ripple through his hide again. "Kane Stormheart," she said, "I think you're going to fit in just fine with our little band of misfits." As the Stardancer continued through hyperspace toward their next destination, Kane found himself hoping that the mission would last a very long time. He'd spent his entire life following predetermined paths, but something about Elena Voss made him want to discover what lay beyond the edges of every map he'd ever seen. Maybe impossible wasn't such a bad thing after all. The Nexus station hung in the void like a crystalline spider, its countless levels and connecting bridges forming a complex web of commerce and corruption. Devon Cross adjusted his worn leather jacket and ran a hand through his unruly black hair, studying the station's schematics on his portable display. Beside him, a shadow seemed to detach itself from the wall. Nyx Voidwalker materialized from her natural camouflage, her obsidian skin shifting from perfect invisibility to a deep, starlight-speckled black. "Security protocols have been updated since our last intelligence report," Nyx said, her voice carrying the whispered quality of her shadow-dwelling people. Her silver eyes, large and luminous in her angular face, tracked the movement of security drones through the station's corridors. The data core is now protected by quantum encryption locks and biometric scanners calibrated for 17 different species. Devon grinned, the expression transforming his ordinary features into something almost roguish. Good thing I brought my secret weapon then. Which is? Absolutely no idea what I'm doing. Nyx's elegant features, all sharp angles and ethereal beauty, registered something between horror and fascination. Her people, the Umbral, were masters of stealth and precision. Every infiltration was planned to the smallest detail, every contingency accounted for. This human's casual approach to what should have been a delicate operation went against everything she'd been trained to believe. Devon, she said carefully, we need those files. The corruption evidence inside that data core is the only thing that can expose the syndicate's connections to legitimate businesses across 3 sectors. We cannot simply improvise. Watch me, he said with a wink that made her silver skin shimmer with an involuntary flush. They'd been working together for 3 days now, ever since Marcus and Zara had discovered that the rescue mission was connected to something much larger. The scientists hadn't just been random kidnapping victims, they'd been specifically targeted because their research threatened a vast criminal network that reached into the highest levels of galactic government. Nyx found herself studying Devon as he worked, trying to understand how someone so seemingly chaotic could have earned a reputation as one of the finest tech specialists in the Outer Rim. His equipment was a patchwork of different technologies, human innovations jury-rigged alongside alien systems in combinations that should have been incompatible. Yet somehow, it all worked. There, Devon said, plugging a device that looked like it had been assembled from scrap metal into the station's maintenance access port. My universal key. That's impossible, Nyx breathed, watching as his improvised device began cycling through security protocols at a rate that defied comprehension. Those systems aren't compatible. The quantum matrices alone should cause cascade failures in. Nyx, Devon interrupted gently, sometimes the best way through a locked door isn't to pick the lock. Sometimes you just need to convince the door that it was never locked in the first place. His device chirped softly, and the maintenance shaft's security grid deactivated. As they made their way through the station's hidden passages, Nyx found herself marveling at Devon's unconventional methods. Where she would have spent hours mapping patrol routes and timing guard rotations, he simply followed the flow of the station's systems, using maintenance schedules and cleaning protocols to predict where security would be weakest. How do you know the waste processing cycle will create a blind spot in Sector 7? She asked as they paused at a junction. Devon shrugged. Because people are predictable, even when their technology isn't. The guards in that sector are going to avoid the smell, which means they'll cluster near the air recycling intakes on the other side of the corridor. He was right, of course. Nyx's enhanced vision confirmed that the security personnel had indeed shifted their positions exactly as Devon had predicted. It was intuitive understanding of behavior rather than technological superiority, and it was devastatingly effective. Your species, she said quietly as they slipped past the distracted guards, you see patterns that others miss. Maybe, Devon replied, his hand briefly touching her shoulder to guide her around a sensor node. The contact sent an unexpected thrill through her shadow-dark skin. Or maybe we're just too stupid to know when something should be impossible. They reached the data core's chamber, and Nyx felt her breath catch. The security here was unlike anything she'd ever seen, layers upon layers of quantum encryption, biometric scanners, and defensive protocols that would have challenged the greatest thieves in galactic history. This is going to take hours, she said, studying the complex array of defenses. Even with my infiltration training, the quantum locks alone will require. Devon walked up to the central console and plugged in another of his improvised devices. What are you doing? Nyx hissed. Something wonderfully stupid, he replied with that infuriating grin. Instead of trying to break through the security, his device began talking to it. Literally. The quantum encryption matrices started responding as if they were having a conversation with an old friend. Security protocols that should have been impossible to bypass simply opened. How? Nix demanded, her training warring with the evidence of her own eyes. I asked nicely, Devon said, beginning to download the corruption files. Amazing how far good manners will get you with an AI that's been ignored and treated like a tool for the past 15 years. As the data transfer progressed, alarms suddenly began blaring throughout the station. Not security alarms, something else entirely. The station's main reactor, Nix said, her enhanced hearing picking up the subtle changes in the facility's power systems. Something's wrong. Devon's expression grew serious as he checked his readings. Not wrong. Sabotage. Someone else is here, and they're trying to destroy the evidence we came for. The lights flickered ominously, and through the chamber's transparent walls, they could see emergency barriers beginning to seal corridors throughout the station. Can you get us out? Nix asked, pressing close to him as the temperature began to rise. Devon's hands flew over his improvised console, his casual demeanor replaced by intense concentration. Not through conventional routes. The lockdown protocols are designed to contain any potential reactor breach. Then how? Trust me, he said, his brown eyes meeting her silver ones. Do you trust me, Nix? The question hung between them, loaded with implications that went far beyond their current predicament. Her people didn't trust easily, survival in the shadows required careful evaluation of every alliance, every partnership. But Devon had already proven that his seemingly chaotic methods produced results that careful planning couldn't match. Yes, she said simply. Devon's smile was brilliant. Then hold on to me and whatever happens, don't let go. He activated something on his universal device, and suddenly the chamber's artificial gravity shut off. But instead of floating helplessly, Devon had somehow tapped into the station's maintenance systems, using cleaning drones and cargo manipulators to create an improvised escape route through service passages that shouldn't have been accessible. As they flew through the station's mechanical arteries, propelled by Devon's impossible network of co-opted systems, Nix found herself pressed against his chest, breathing in his distinctly human scent, something warm and earthy that made her feel safe despite their desperate circumstances. Devon, she said, her voice barely audible over the rush of air around them. Yeah. When this is over, would you teach me? About trusting improvisation? His arms tightened around her. Only if you teach me about moving through shadows. I have a feeling we're going to need both skills for what's coming next. They burst out of the station's outer hull through a waste disposal port just as the reactor breach reached critical mass. Devon's hijacked escape pod, another impossible jury-rigged creation, carried them clear just as Nexus Station's central core exploded in a brilliant flash that lit up the surrounding space. As they drifted in the aftermath, the corruption data safely stored in Devon's systems, Nix realized that something fundamental had changed between them. She'd spent her life believing that precision and planning were the keys to survival, but Devon had shown her that sometimes the most important victories came from embracing chaos and trusting in the impossible. The data, she said, suddenly worried. Safe, Devon assured her, his arms still holding her close in the pod's cramped confines. Backed up in 17 different locations using protocols that don't technically exist yet. Nix laughed, a sound like silver wind chimes that she'd never made before meeting this impossible human. You're completely insane. Probably, Devon agreed, his forehead resting against hers. Is that going to be a problem? Looking into his warm brown eyes, feeling the solid strength of his arms around her, Nix realized that insanity might be exactly what she'd been missing her entire life. No, she whispered, just before their lips met in a kiss that tasted like starlight and impossible dreams. I think I'm starting to like impossible. Epilogue. When stars align. 6 months later, the four couples stood together on the observation deck of the luxury liner Celestial Dawn, watching the triple sunset paint the clouds of New Geneva in shades of gold and crimson. The corruption scandal had brought down 3 governments and exposed criminal networks across a dozen sectors, but more importantly, it had brought them all together. Marcus and Zara stood at the deck's edge, her silver skin glowing softly in the sunset light as she leaned against his shoulder. "Still think it was just luck?" she asked, referring to his impossible shots that had started their adventure. "Nope," Marcus replied, his arm tightening around her waist. "I think it was destiny wearing a disguise." Nearby, Elena and Kane were engaged in a heated but affectionate argument about optimal flight paths, their voices carrying the kind of comfortable banter that came from months of shared adventures. Kane's scales had settled into a permanent warm gold whenever Elena was near, a fact that made her grin every time she noticed. "You know," Elena said, interrupting their debate to gesture at the sunset, "I never thought I'd say this, but maybe following the map isn't so bad when the map leads you home." Kane's golden eyes softened. "And where is home, exactly?" "Wherever you are," she replied simply, making his scales shimmer with pleasure. Devon and Nyx materialized from the shadows near the deck center, literally, in Nyx's case, though she'd learned to appreciate Devon's more dramatic entrances. His latest invention, a device that could supposedly predict romantic compatibility through quantum resonance analysis, sat forgotten on a nearby table. "Any readings on that thing?" Marcus called over. Devon glanced at the device, then at Nyx's ethereal beauty, then back at his friends. "You know what? Some things don't need to be measured. Some things just are." Nyx smiled, her silver eyes catching the last rays of the setting sun. "Devon Cross, philosopher. Who would have thought? Amazing what the impossible can teach you," he replied, pulling her close. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky above New Geneva, the four couples stood together, human and alien, chaos and order, precision and intuition, all of them proof that sometimes the most beautiful things happen when you stop believing in limitations and start believing in love. After all, as they'd learned, impossible was just another word for something that hadn't happened yet. And in a universe full of infinite possibilities, love was the most impossible, and most inevitable, thing of all.